Hi, everyone. Joshua Barndt. I'm the Senior Manager of Development Strategy at the Neighborhood Land Trust. Thank you all for being here. So in this talk, I'm going to reflect on the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, which is work that I've been a part of for 11 years as staff. And the goal is to try to imagine where we might go, give some framing to some of that. How we can expand our impact in the community and impact social transformation, as Cooney has helped us kind of warm up on, but to build a more socially just and politically just world. It is important to recognize that up front that due to my positionality as a settler, white male, a middle-class person, there are limitations to my analysis and perspective. The issues I'm discussing today impact working class racialized people in more complex ways than I can understand through my own lived experience. But I'll nonetheless try to incorporate the perspectives and analysis that I have had the privilege to experience through my work with my collaborators and our team, as well as community members. And I should also note that today I don't speak formally on behalf of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. I'm just one staff, one participant, one member. And the ideas that I'm sharing are my own reflections drawn from our collective experience. I also intend to bring these ideas back to our community through a community planning process to dialogue with community members and see what resonates with folks. So I found the process helpful. And I hope that these reflections can also be useful to other community practitioners, CLTs, community organizers, and progressive planners in the room today. So we're going to go through a few things. A little introduction, reframe the land trust a bit. Theory of transformation, scaling again, because it's a critical issue, solidarity economy, and social practices. So the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust was founded over a decade ago in response to gentrification and real estate speculation, which was causing displacement of both residents, but also communities serving land uses, such as nonprofits. This is a photo of our legal clinic being evicted from their space to make room for this. And from the beginning, we recognized that this was a struggle over land. In the colonial capitalist dominant system that we live in, private owners and corporations have the power to make decisions about how land is used, how it is developed, who will benefit, and who gets excluded. And inspired by mostly BIPOC-led organized communities in the US, we established a community land trust to replace private property with land that is collectively owned and controlled. While our initial response was reactive to this escalating crisis, the people who came together around the land trust were not new to community organizing. They'd been involved in community struggles for a long time. They developed other community-led institutions. They came with analysis of the issue, and they came with experience. So the land trust emerged from a history of organizing in Parkdale. And the CLT was not just imagined as a defensive strategy against gentrification, but a strategy to build a community-controlled institution for equitable development. And so what was our vision? Our vision was to ensure that eventually everyone in our community gets benefit from the development and that does not displace them, but that enhances the social, economic, and environmental cultural well-being of our community, has access to affordable and adequate housing, inclusive economic opportunities, healthy food, community programs, et cetera. And also we were interested in inspiring the growth of a community land trust movement, which it's amazing to see that it's happening today. In 2012, it was just an idea of residents thinking that this is a new strategy that could help in that protracted battle. In 2017, we acquired our first property, the Milky Way Garden, followed by our first residential property only in 2019. But now we own 86 properties, 208 affordable units, 200 units in planning and development. What do y'all think? Can I just y'all have some paper, I think, yes? If anyone in the room was involved in any of that work, can you please raise your green paper? Yeah, give everyone a round of applause. Do it again, hold it up. Hold it up as high as you can. All right, and as I keep going, if there's an idea you really like just like wave the paper. Give me some energy, give each other some energy. All right. We're really proud of what we've achieved. And the base is growing too. We have over 1,000 registered members, 20 of whom are elected to our representative board of directors, the decision-making body of the organization. By securing all of this land and housing that we now steward, we provide housing to over 200 households, and an estimated 400 people are benefiting from that preservation work. This work is carried out by 7 staff, and our properties are managed by 5 operating partners who also have staff teams. That includes Park St. Felix Center, YWCA Toronto, the Neighborhood Group, and West Neighborhood House. Yeah, so there's a lot of work that goes into this. I'm just one person of hundreds involved in this work. And then now there's just this amazing national movement of over 45 community land trusts across Canada. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Thank you. Well, yeah, keep yourselves warm. It's kind of cold in here, right? Okay. Yeah, and we're also gaining growing economic power in our neighborhood. I'm going to talk about that a lot tonight. There's also many challenges and contradictions in our work. The work has not been easy. Our board members and staff are tired and overworked. Do all our tenants feel that we're providing the highest quality of service that they deserve? Not always. The land trusts and our housing partners are under-resourced, and sometimes we struggle with capacity issues which impacts the services to tenants. And even when we have community-owned housing, the antagonisms between landlords and tenants persist. They're rooted in the capitalist property relations, but we engage in them. And so there's conflict between our housing managing partners and tenants. Do all residents in the community have equitable access to housing, decent work, community programs, green spaces? No. Our direct impact remains quite limited to the residents of these 86 properties, and mostly in just 1 or 2 of their material or social needs. So the community needs much more: housing, decent work, etc. We live in a capitalist dominant system, one where speculative real estate markets monopolize land and housing. Democracy feels precarious these days, don't you think? The ecological crisis is accelerating, and the geopolitical instability that we see is scary. Against this backdrop, our accomplishments, while meaningful, remain small in relation to the bigger challenges we face. To truly have access to housing, equitable housing, economic opportunity, well-being, we need a more just, socially and politically just society. Surprise, surprise, I don't know if you would guess, but I believe that this means a transformation from a capitalist dominant system towards a more democratic, equitable, and socialist in character. A society organized around care, cooperation, and collective stewardship. With this in mind, the questions I'm going to explore tonight are: what role does the hyperlocal work of community land trust development play in broader societal transformation? What practices and strategies best support that transformation? First, we're going to start with theory, which I personally find challenging. I don't know about y'all, but lots of big words, lots of big ideas. It's like going to therapy. You go in like, you're like, I know I have a problem. And then you leave and you're like, I have a problem. It can be a little bit overwhelming. So yeah, so there's even theory about theory. So how is theory useful? Well, Eric Olin Wright, a pretty amazing Marxist sociologist, has theorized a lot about social transformation, and he proposes that there's a few useful uses for theory. It helps us diagnose and critique the current system, pinpointing why it's not working for us. Theory helps us imagine alternatives, identifying potentially new directions that we might want to walk towards, or work towards, or fight towards. Theory helps us understand the process and strategies of transformation, telling us how we want to get from here to there, and how to make viable alternatives a reality. While we could critique capitalism endlessly, I'm sure you all have lots of thoughts on this, I'm going to focus on 2 major critiques, and we'll start there. An indigenous critique from some current practitioners, and a Marxist critique. So I've already stated that I believe that we live in a capitalist dominant economy. This is also a settler colonial state. Capitalism and colonialism are historically and presently interconnected and interdependent. We are very privileged to have amazing Indigenous practitioners and scholars active in the CLT movement today. And so I just like to share their words to get us started. Maggie Lowe, in her paper, More Than Just Housing, The Emergence of Indigenous Community Land Trust, Land Back and Healing, writes, perhaps the most destructive legal mechanism introduced by settler colonialism is the concept of private property. Legal frameworks pertaining to private property criminalize traditional practices of Indigenous people, such as nomadic lifestyles, food systems, and communal land use, effectively legitimizing their dispossession and marginalization. This private property regime was and is enforced by cultural and physical genocidal violence and structural oppression of Indigenous peoples. The harm, of course, goes deeper too. The colonial logic treats land as a commodity to be bought and sold, not as kin, severing critical relationships between people and land. As chair of Vancouver's Community Land Trust CLT, Norm Leach reminds us, its colonized systems and ways, its colonized systems and ways, It's colonized systems and ways of thinking that convince humans that they are separate. And that's the starting point of Western colonized philosophy. To be separate and disconnected from land is trauma. Sorry, just 1 second. My screen turned off. So, to continue, while the center work of decolonization is the return of land, while the central work of decolonization is the return of the land back, restoring Indigenous worldviews is essential to this work. Reflecting on the potential of CLTs to forward land back and the abolishment of private property, Maggie reflects, if the assumption of private property is absolute, then at best CLTs offer a more ethical, community-based model to distribute the benefits of land ownership. Similarly, Indigenous CLTs are ways for nations and Indigenous urban diaspora to gain autonomy over their housing, healing, and governance. If, however, the goal is decolonization, meaning the dismantling of private property, CLTs would not need to exist, and other and different forms of land use could take place. This is an important framing. CLTs are a promising tool for decolonization to support land back and collective stewardship, but due to their deep enmeshment with colonial property regimes, they may only be a transitory solution. Norm Leach challenges us to rethink transformation, not just as something new, but as a return, as Cooney shared. It's about restoring original relationship with the land that all humans had at the beginning. It predates private property. We are learning that the best way to heal from our trauma from genocide and colonization is to reconnect with land. If we reconnect with land, we reconnect with our ancestors, each other, and the universe. For Norm, CLTs must go beyond stewardship of property, focusing on righting relations, decolonizing governance practices, spending time on the land, and focusing on healing. This identifies for us the importance of land-based relational practices in CLT work. Now to a Marxist critique. What up, yo, Marx? Early CLT practitioners were quite influenced by Marxist theory and his critique of property. You know, Marx was thinking property stems from private ownership, so pretty similar to Indigenous critiques of land and also production. Capitalists extract surplus value from labor and land. Real estate enables the accumulation and extraction of wealth accumulation and extraction without productive work, and commodifying land drives inequality and displacement. And Marx's solution, surprise, surprise, was to collectivize the ownership of land and production that would create shared prosperity. David Harvey extended Marxist thinking to connect it with the urban. Harvey identified that urban land and housing absorbs capital surplus, and through financialization, we're all aware of these processes in our communities, and drives real estate speculation and investment cycles. Harvey suggests that the struggle shifts from the factory, which Marx was thinking about the means of production being the factory, to the city, reclaiming public space and community control over urban life. And he suggests that socializing housing helps reclaim the space that sustains daily life, our homes, services, our neighborhoods, and fulfills what he calls the right to the city, the collective right to shape our urban space and the way resources are used. Now, my favorite theorist, Kalia Akuno, who's actually an organizer, organizing around community land trust work and racial justice work in the US. He, down in Jackson, Mississippi, he builds on this. Capitalist urbanization is not race neutral. It is built upon colonial and racialized extraction of land, labor, and life. The working class can reclaim control over the means of production and social reproduction through the solidarity economy, grounded in networks of cooperatives and mutual aid initiatives. And the struggle for economic democracy is a prelude to eco-socialism, transforming production to serve social needs and ecological renewal. I believe that Kalia Kuno's work and the work of Cooperation Jackson is very inspiring, and it sort of links directly back to the roots of CLT work. As aptly synthesized in a recent paper by Jason Spicer, communal land trusts were originally designed as the heart of a political liberation project by Black civil rights organizers who drew on diverse international sources in creating the CLT model, which initially included not just housing, but plans to house other community enterprises such as cooperatives and related organizational forms. So the founders of the CLT movement and some of the best thinkers of the CLT movement in the US today saw the CLT not just as an institutional model for housing, but for economic democracy, a structure that could socialize land, foster cooperative enterprise, and advance racial and economic justice more broadly. In synthesis, we're kind of working towards the control, not just the production, of reproduction in our communities, housing, land, and urban life. So how does transformation happen? So back to Eric Olin Wright. He thought a lot about this. He's got a great framework. He describes that we have three economic systems, and we're going to talk about how they change. So we have capitalism, where the means of production are privately owned, and resources are allocated through the exercise of economic power by companies and capitalists. We have a statist system, which is what most people would associate with a state socialism, where it's like the types of socialism we haven't loved, where the means of production are state-owned and allocation occurs through state power. And then socialism, where the means of production are socially owned and resources are governed through social power, that is the civil society itself. It's a bit different than the other forms. And Wright suggests that the current system that we're in is not purely capitalist, but it's a hybrid system, capitalist dominant, yet containing both statist and socialist elements. And then transformation, therefore, isn't a sudden revolution or change from one system to another, but it's a reconfiguration of power among economic, political, and social spheres. Our task then, Wright suggests, is to expand social power, to deepen community and economic control over the economy. In his book, Real Utopias, Wright takes us through a crazy, honestly, you should read it, it's crazy, empirical assessment of how society might change. Can we identify how to get to socialism? Will it happen? And he suggests that there's just too many unknown factors. There's too many emergent factors in the world that will impact what is possible. And instead, we need to, he suggests instead the goal should be to work towards expanding social power, to deepen community and democratic control, while constantly monitoring the changing political context and adjusting our strategies. So it's not like a clear path, but we know what we need to do. He also identifies a set of strategies and buckets of strategies. We all know about ruptural transformation, revolution. Let's overthrow the state This path is not particularly valuable these days because the state violence that comes from that process is horrific to everyone involved. In addition, so the next one is interstitial strategies, building alternatives within capitalism. And this is about creating alternative institutions that embody different values and relations, such as the community land trust. They become living prototypes for the society we want. We develop them in the cracks and we hope that they grow. And then there's symbiotic transformation, and this one's also critical to CLTs, but working through the state to try to influence the state to create enabling policies, programs, and resources that expand social power, labor laws, acquisition funds, housing programs, etc. I think that both interstitial strategies, what we're doing, and symbiotic strategies become ways that we need to organize ourselves towards gaining more social power. So to be clear, and CUNY made it very clear actually, I say, CLTs are just not automatically transformative. It requires political intent and intentional practices. Many CLTs in the US solely work on the provision of affordable home ownership and do almost no other political mobilization or progressive work. In this paper by Spencer, Jason Spencer, Nicholas Shadden, and Olivia Williams, and it's a recent paper and it's quite good. They identify both technocratic and transformative CLTs. Technocratic CLTs operate primarily as housing delivery vehicles within existing systems. Driven by the requirements of funding, they reflect what is called affirmative politics, improving conditions of people, but within dominant structures. On the other hand, transformative CLTs embed community organizing, solidarity, economy, collaboration, and advocacy into their work. They seek to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice through community control of land, and they implement specific strategies to do that. 6 strategies that were identified by interviewing more radical CLTs in the US are identified here, and I believe that our land trust, the PNLT, and many of our partners are active in all or most of these strategies. The transformative potential of the CLT is not defined by ownership, by making it community owned or nonprofit, but by the intentional strategies we use. So let's talk about scale. Scale is controversial, and my view on scale may be controversial as well. Scaling is often associated with the technocratic CLTs, where they're driven by unit count, drawn into bureaucratization, and just dealing with the complexity of managing complex affordable housing projects. Staff and boards get overburdened and tied down by funder requirements. And so then radical priorities of these organizations get deprioritized. CUNY references quite a bit. In a decade, our land trust has done some scaling. 86 properties, 200 units, not nothing. This growth was intentional. It was part of a strategic growth plan to increase our impact, scale our community governance model, and reach financial sustainability. If we're committed to long-term stewardship, this is critical. And I know we need to scale more. Firstly, to respond to the constantly growing needs in our community, housing, work, food, but also because we're in a unique political moment. After 30 years of disinvestment, there is currently public funding to support affordable housing development and expansion. And if broader social transformation is a goal, albeit a long-term goal, we will need to use the moment, this moment, to expand and consolidate alternative institutions like CLTs locally and regionally. Now our question is, how do we scale this model? In our work, we've used 4 strategies that I think are useful for other communities to think about. And they each respond to a different opportunity and or challenge our communities faced. So the first is the acquisition of private rental buildings, and it's moving these private rental buildings out of the market and making sure these buildings stay affordable for existing residents. When the Land Trust completed our rooming house study, we identified that we needed to do this, but there was no government funding that could support that. We tried to buy buildings anyways, and we had over a dozen failed acquisitions in just a year and a half. And through our advocacy, we finally convinced our councilor to implement, uh, yeah, a pilot program, which allowed us to purchase the first building. But at the end of that acquisition, there was no more funding. We had to go back and continue the advocacy to create a multi-unit acquisition program, which is now available to many communities across the city. This like first motion that asked staff to explore it was released on my birthday. It was a very happy birthday for me. And we eventually acquired a 36 unit building on Maynard. And we continue to purchase buildings every year or two. And with this type of program, we can, on a consistent basis, bring properties out of the market and grow our portfolios. I should say that this program has now supported the acquisition and preservation of 1,000 units across the city. Yeah. There's also the acquisition of social assets. In 2021, we acquired 82 buildings from Toronto Community Housing. These buildings they're publicly owned and they're dispersed assets, so they kind of exist across a big geography in the city. And in different political moments, conservative councils would try to sell the buildings. And at one point, about 100 of them were sold. And so tenants organized and progressive councilors collaborated with those tenant groups. And eventually, there was an effort made to move these buildings out of the city ownership, out of public housing ownership, and into the community ownership through nonprofits. And so we became the steward of 82 properties, and Circle Community Land Trust, which we have some folks here from today, they steward, yeah, yeah. They steward over 500. Over 600, thank you. So this is a strategy that sometimes is important to preserve housing in our community, but it's not necessarily the most, let's say, like, I think as impactful as developing or acquiring private properties, because these are already socially owned assets. But it is important that we make sure that they're not lost, and we play a role in that. This portfolio was quite large, so when we were thinking of taking it over, we knew we need to work with a larger organization that had the capacity to work at scale. And so we partnered with YWAC Toronto, and they actually operate the buildings while we are the asset managers and owners on behalf of the community. And these buildings came in a state of disrepair. So our staff, most of our staff team spends all of their time implementing a 5-year capital repair program in these homes. And honestly, repairing and improving homes is relational. Tenants are impacted by the work. We go and we consult them on that work. We work with them through a process of improving their homes. Intensification. So when we own land, there's actually sometimes opportunities to add units through adding extensions or intensifying the site in other ways. This is 128 Havelock. It's not just an idea, we're doing it. We're turning a 5-room home into 10 affordable units and 3 accessible units in Scatter Home portfolio. And we just completed our first building that we constructed. And it's a 2-unit building at 6 Shipman. And it's our first fully accessible unit. And by doing little projects like this, they seem small, but they're not small. Tenants were able to move out of a house where one person was living in a 3-bedroom house. They were overhoused. And they moved into the top floor, and it freed up a house for a whole household, a whole family. So, again, like, for the first time, we can provide actually accessible housing. Oops, wrong way. Oh yeah, and Maynard, the other building you saw in the other photo, it's not accessible. So we're trying to do a project to add a new floor, an elevator, add 9 new accessible units, and then create mobility for all tenants. And then finally, development. And for us, it's development on public lands, because buying land and development is kind of risky. So we think that the city and the government are the best partners. And the city doesn't just offer the land, you have to kind of mobilize to get them to do it. In the community plan in 2016, CUNY identified that there were, through the process, identified that there were these co-located public sites, and community members kind of advocated when we looked at that in workshops, why don't we make the city redevelop them? And then through a community process, and we could get more housing and we could get more community space. The kind of city has land to help our community do what it needs. And I made this little graphic for the report in 2016. And then the next year, Councillor Gord Perks championed the idea. And there's been an 8-year planning process, which we've made sure that residents and equity deserving members of our community are in those consultations, making demands on the city. And in the process, because residents were like, we need a lot of housing in this development, as much housing as you can put. We need a community center, yes, but we need a lot of housing. The city expropriated the Dollarama to create the opportunity for a 16-story rental building. And this summer, we had the opportunity to put in a proposal to potentially build and own this 16-story building. And so we put in a proposal to build a 16-story building with 175 residential units, 88 of which will be permanently affordable, and the rest will be market, but with rent control. And this building, if it gets built, will have 27,000 square feet of community space. And we hear there might be an announcement next week. I don't know. And we know that this is possible because our partners are winning like this too. Dominique's here, and Dominique identified this parking lot in Kensington Market, I don't know, like 5 years ago, held a consultation without the city's permission, and then they won an RFP. The city did the same process. They won the RFP, and they're also going to be the stewards of this 78-unit affordable housing projects. So scaling requires enabling policy and municipal support. This is just amazing. You know, Mura, when it happened, we bought a building, we bought another, but the program created opportunities for other partners to also do it. And by the end of this year, 500 units in Parkdale will have been preserved by nonprofits in our community. 500 units. So enabling policy spurs collective impact. This is one of the buildings sold last week, the Good Shepherd. Used to be owned by Hazelview, formerly known as Timber Creek. This is a building on Jameson, purchased by St. Clair's Housing. 150 units between two buildings on Jameson. Used to be owned by Hazelview, Timber Creek, known for the biggest eviction in Canadian history. This building was bought in New Commons with Woodgreen in collaboration on Jameson, 80 units. Through scaling, we're getting collective action, and this is big. We also need to name the moment, because, yeah, we might have good strategies and good ideas, but they're not always possible. When Mura was first created, they allocated $10 million a year. It's like 2 to 3 acquisitions, right? Not very much. And then there was a little scandal, I don't even remember. And progressives at Progress Toronto and in other places and in our communities identified this as an opportunity to make sure that to take advantage of a progressive mayor coming forward, and they put Mura at the top of the housing program. And so this was a political moment, a political opportunity that allowed Mura to go from $10 million a year to $100 million. And so that growth we just talked about, it came from that conjunctural opportunity. We need to organize beyond the local. We can organize in our communities, but we need to be connected with these progressive organizations, federations that have the power to influence policy and are working in politics too. We saw this with the extension of Mura. There's now a federal program that's going to be coming out of the federal government that's been allocated $1.5 billion to support acquisition of rental buildings. And we've been advocating for this for a while. Like we were all the community land trusts were saying we need this. But it took other federations taking on that work to get this program picked up by the government. And so the moving the mark was these other big federations that had more political influence taking on that work. So these are some cool slides on the increase of affordable housing in Parkdale. In 2016, of nonprofit housing, not including Toronto Community Housing, there were 772 units. By the end of this year, there's going to be 1,390. That's an 88% increase. By 2030, just on the projects I'm aware of are in planning and sort of making an estimate about what will happen with Mura, we'll see a 227% increase of nonprofit-owned housing in Parkdale. And what does this look like compared to the market? Amazingly, actually, in 2016, 20% of households in Parkdale lived in socially owned housing. It's actually pretty incredible because the average in Canada is somewhere between 3 and 5%. And by the end of this year, we'll have increased that to 25%. And if that continues, we may increase it to 34%, which is really, really, really important because data shows from other countries that have higher percentages of social housing that once you get above 20 and definitely above 30% of the market being socially owned, it impacts the rental market. Private landlords cannot charge as much because there's other options. And so, I took the strategies that we've been working on and like, what might happen if we kind of keep going, And I thought, there's probably not always going to be money, right? So there's going to be moments of growth, and then there might be a moment of austerity again, where 10, 15, 30 years, like we just experienced, there's less money invested in housing. So we're going to have these moments of growth, and then we're going to have these moments of stabilizing and stewardship. I think we need to think really critically about the opportunities and our responsibilities in each of those moments. If we think about these growth cycles, we might know that when there's a political moment and opportunity to grow, I want to advocate that we focus on growth. Doesn't mean we abandon the other issues, but we have to take those opportunities because we know from history that they're followed by periods, sometimes very long periods of austerity. And so we need to stabilize our organizations, get them to the scale, socialize as much housing as possible in those moments, and then spend that time, and we buy the opportunity to work over the longer term on our other goals in addition. And, some people say like, oh, the professionalization of community land trusts or nonprofits. I'm like, we absolutely need highly expert, amazing staff, but we need dual capacity teams. We need experts in asset management, property management, building and planning housing, and we need experts in the radical relational work. And I think we're getting them. There's so many amazing people coming out of this program and coming out of the communities, and so we're getting this like dual skilled, but also like teams that have these amazing high capacities. And so let's just think about scaling governance because scale impacts our governance structures. So we have a complex governance structure. We have anyone who lives or works in the community can join the land trust, and then they can elect out of that membership representatives of our board, which is our decision-making body. And so in a sense, there's direct democracy there. Residents in the community are making decisions about what the land trust does with land. As we scaled, we realized that as we had all this housing over large geographies, that the actual residents of our homes, the tenants, didn't really have like a meaningful way to engage with that governance structure. There's tenant representatives on our board. 5 of the 15 board members are tenants, but when they're on the board, they are thinking about the priorities of the organization, the community as a whole, not necessarily the issues of their portfolio or their building. So we created these tenant advisory committees, which are places where we sit at the table, our housing partners sit at the table, and tenants sit at the table. Tenants can self-select to be on these tenant committees, and we talk about the issues of management and asset management and tenant issues. So it's supposed to be a space for tenant voice, but there's of course challenges. Our partners, for example, are landlords, and they have to deal with the landlord-tenant relationship, which requires that there's a landlord to tenant discourse. So when like conflict emerges, when problems happen, they're individualized through the landlord and tenant legal system. So it kind of gets in the way of some of the more collective processes of resolving these issues. And in addition, the influence of our direct democracy process means that the members pick the board, which are community members, and then the board picks our housing partners, and then the housing partners operate the housing. And in that system, while tenants have a voice through the tenant advisory committee, they don't have power, tenant power. And so, to some extent, it's a place where we could think about extending direct democracy down closer to the resident level. Cooperative housing is one way to do that. We've selected for now nonprofit management. But if we wanted to increase direct democracy, we could explore that by bringing that direct democracy down to the building management level. So I'm going to transition to talking about the solidarity economy. And basically, like this section is actually really exciting because it's about how can we leverage the growing economic influence to expand the solidarity economy using this scale that I was talking about before, not just to house people, but to reshape the local economy. The idea of the solidarity economy has roots in Latin America, and it is a global movement. But on a local scale, it proposes a system of economic relations, enterprises, and institutions that organize production, exchange, and consumption around cooperation, mutual aid, and democratic control, prioritizing community well-being and ecological sustainability over profit. So, like Eric Olin Wright said, it's kind of about expanding social power in the economy. And for 10 years, we've been organizing for this in Parkdale. CUNY led the Parkdale planning process back in 2016. And this first study that we released was about community economic development. At least it's like center focus and how the community kind of absorbed and thought about it. Focused on trying to do inclusive local development, job creation, and mitigate displacement through community planning. And while CUNY was pretty like radical in his thinking, the way that many of us interpret it was that we're trying to build capacity for the expansion of social businesses and community wealth, but within the existing systems. And we're going to fight the developers to get more X, these kind of things. This planning continued, and in 2024, led by a group of amazing community organizers, Mercedes, Miru, Fatine, and others, there was an update to the plans. We have a 2024 community plan, and it was focused more around the solidarity economy framework, moving beyond inclusion towards transformation of economic relations. To build a just and sustainable economy in Parkdale where community members have collective ownership and decision-making power over resources, decent work, and shared wealth. A transition from extractive, exploitative economy towards a caring and regenerative one. And it's been a bumpy road. We've been working on this. There's like 30 organizations involved, hundreds of residents through many initiatives, but it's been a bumpy road. Like a few years into this work, the West End Food Co-op went under. More recently, Parkdale People's Economy now has no staff. It's not held by any organizations. It's just an idea that we're all seeking to implement. So it hasn't gone perfectly. We fought developers and won a few battles, but lost most of them. But there's also been some big successes, and I think the land trust work, at least from my positionality, seems to be one that's building momentum in this Parkdale People's Economy ecosystem of activity. There was a major $20 million investment in our repair program, and we're using that in creative ways. We've created a social employment partnership with a social enterprise building up, and there's massive opportunity emerging from this investment in these acquisitions of 500 units by the City of Toronto. So I've begun to see that basically the CLT may be a potential infrastructure to support the enhancement and expansion of the solidarity economy. Land and housing channel significant economic activity, from development and finance to operation, maintenance, and rents. Every contract, service, and rent payment is an opportunity to redirect value. The community land trust changes the equation, first by socializing the ownership of housing, to preserve community equity, and reclaiming social surplus and reinvesting it locally. But finally, the CLT can act as an engine of community investment in the solidarity economy by strategically redirecting the economic flows of those assets to local enterprise, cooperatives, and tenant-led initiatives. It's not moving forward. Hello. Oh, caught up. Great. Huh. So how did we decide where to invest these shared resources? Yes, okay, great. This is a slide of Chi from the Chinatown Community Land Trust talking about a framework that was introduced by Jason Spicer and Evan Casper Futterman. And it thinks about different logics of community economic development, which is basically what we're thinking about right now. One logic is pay up. So basically trying to convince the existing economic actors to do things better, to create benefits for residents. Things like community benefit agreements, asking the developer to create jobs or create units. And then there's more made here, they call it localist approaches, which is, you might have a social enterprise that provides employment to minority groups, or anchor institution programs trying to convince a hospital to hire locally. These create like material benefits from residents, but they don't challenge the existing power structures or systems. They kind of reinforce them in the end. And then there's economic democracy approaches to community economic development, which is about creating a new system. I should probably explain why this is important. So I think that we can, we have to admit that we should fight for any material benefit we can get for residents. If it means trying to convince a shitty developer that's building something in our community to make affordable housing, that's going to be good. But if we can choose, why wouldn't we choose to invest in the initiatives that are going to build the solidarity economy? So we might think over time that as we continue to gain more power, that we can make decisions about investing in companies that are more values aligned with the world we want to create. And this involves intervening in developers pro forma, because there's a budget to everything, and the budget decides what happens. Teddy Cruz, which is he's a very cool progressive architect that I'm inspired by. He has a slide similar to this in his presentation, and I love it. Because we can direct capital and operating budgets towards these activities. We've started to do this through social procurement. We created a social procurement and sustainability action framework, and it helped us think about how we could invest money that we spend on improving our buildings to create work for residents. We created a pilot with Building Up, which is a social enterprise, where we contract them to do lots of renovations, you'll see in a moment. And they hire residents, provide them paid training opportunities and pathways to the construction trades. And this is crazy. Of $13 million that we've contracted for capital repairs, 16% has gone to Building Up, that one social enterprise. That created, there were opportunities for 30 people who were recruited from our neighborhoods. There were 109 trainees who worked on our site, so residents also from other communities have supported the work on our sites. And there's 10,832 training hours that were produced through those contracts. If we look at our procurement to social vendors more generally, so not just the Building Up, but to vendors that fit other categories, 77% of our spending has gone to social vendors. That's 10 million out of 13 million. Right? And not all those social vendors are currently in the solidarity economy. Some of them are local, some of them are small businesses, some of them are decent work employers. So, we're making an effort right now to develop relationships with vendors that meet our goals. But over time, we might want to expand our relationships and investments in solidarity economy enterprises. And I think that there's huge opportunity with all this Mura acquisitions. The tenants pay the rent, so all the revenue comes from the tenants, as well as the government through rental subsidies. So let's just remember, the money is the tenants. And then it pays for all the costs. And often we just hire whoever can offer a good service for the cheapest, and we don't care if they're private or whoever, whatever. But what if we decided that we're gonna purchase those services from local social enterprises, from workers' cooperatives, maybe even create tenant-led initiatives so tenants could do some of that work. On one building, and there might be some new funders and supporters if we did that at scale. Some of you might even want to invest in that. We could replace the private banks with community loans. But what would happen if we weren't just thinking about one building, but we're thinking about that 500 units, like all those buildings, if we could convince all our partners to do this procurement with us? We would move from an $11,000 contract to a waste removal social enterprise to a $170,000 annual contract. That's the kind of money that when we get the scale that we could think of, really enhancing the stability of some of the social enterprises in our communities, but maybe even creating new ones where we don't have them, creating new workers' cooperatives to do snow removal, pest control, waste removal. And I think we can start with these activities that we have direct control over. We need these services. They're useful services to our community. But over time, we might want to extend to socializing other important businesses in our community. And maybe businesses that are important to social life, like cafes, laundromats, music venues. So the CLT becomes a solidarity economy infrastructure. And the land trust is busy, our land trust at least is busy renovating buildings and planning new developments and things like that. So we actually currently don't have capacity to create new enterprises. But we're so lucky that in this sector, there are other groups doing it. The Chinatown Community Land Trust is currently doing the Solidarity Economy Enterprise Research Project, where they are going to be starting enterprises out of the CLT work. And they're working with a co-op, a group that creates co-ops, a co-op that creates co-ops, and with Solid State, and they invited us into the project to participate in the research and learn from it. So while we do one thing, other groups are doing other things, and eventually we get really far, and we can do a lot. And then back to Cooperation Jackson, because they're so damn cool. So Cooperation Jackson maybe does this to the highest level. They've gone, their vision is just so solid. They have a CLT, and it grounds a set of other cooperative activities, a federation of workers' cooperatives, a cooperative incubator, a credit union, and an economic democracy school that educates and organizes. So they've grounded the solidarity economy in the CLT and these other activities. And I just love this graphic because it talks about what we're going to talk about next, which is in the center of all of this, housing, cooperatives, et cetera, is the cultural and interpersonal relationships. So the Land Trust was created to challenge the capitalist urbanization that shapes both our city, but also our lives. It isn't just about establishing collective ownership of housing, it's about transforming our relationships. As we've grown, we've secured community control of housing and economic activity, yes. But have our relationships to land, the economy, and community changed? I've witnessed moments of empowerment and cooperation, but also growing pains and capacity issues, as I've talked about. Capitalist power relations and logics persist throughout our work. The landlord-tenant relationship, which I've discussed, and many antagonisms. Some tenants distrust the land trust and our housing partners. Others feel unheard or disconnected. Some may even see us as the new bad landlord they need to fight. As we scale, the demands of development, government funding obligations, bureaucracy, and institutional routines can sometimes stifle participation. That is real. And of course, as we try to do a whole lot of things that I've talked about today with a small team, we can't always do everything the best as good as we'd like, So what are the other practices that are important? Oh, before that, when thinking about the challenges, it would be weird for me to think about the challenges without, I guess, having a name that these are structural issues that we're having to contend with. We're going to improve our processes. But some of these issues are being driven by things out of our control. Our relationships with tenants in the scatter homes, for example, and the private rental buildings are challenged because of the state of the buildings when we purchased them. And it's not something that we did. The fact that Toronto community housing buildings were falling apart when they were transferred to the community is a failure of government for providing appropriate investment in social housing over the last 40 years. The fact that the current market encourages landlords to charge as much rent as they can and doesn't require them to make sure their buildings are in a state of good repair is also enabled by a failure of government, but also just like a society that we, for some reason, have convinced we're going to participate in. So when we buy private buildings, they're in a horrific state of repair. And so we end up in this entangled situation where we're trying to catch up for years of abandonment to some extent. And what is it? An abandonment of responsibility. Because stewardship is responsibility. The photo on the right represents this related issue, sort of that issue I just talked about. But we often have to strip these buildings down to the bones because they've not been taken care of. On the right, though, there's another entanglement which really impacts our relationship with people, and it makes our work really hard, which is that the photo is a unit after an eviction. And as Cooney referenced before, at least in the case of this, the eviction happened not just for economic reasons, but because there were things happening that made staff, residents at risk, and the organization had to take action. Also, this individual was not willing to engage in support and engage and collaborate with the organization or support providers. And we have a lot of empathy that the crises that people are experiencing are structurally linked. They're structurally rooted. But then in any given moment, in the context of managing housing, we have to make decisions. So there's these contradictions we live with, which are really challenging. And honestly, that event was a horrific event for this individual. And it was also an extremely challenging event for everyone involved in the organizations. And I have to say that this is something that is going to be a huge problem that we're going to continue to encounter in this sector, because government funding is coming with strings attached to accept some of the most vulnerable people in this city into housing. And that's critical that we do that we make housing for some of the most vulnerable residents in our communities. It's critical. But the money does not come with the appropriate support or funding to provide the appropriate support and interventions that can ensure that people can live safely in their housing, can maintain their housing. And so this impacts the housing, it impacts the residents, it impacts organizations, and it impacts these individuals who aren't receiving the appropriate support. So we're entangled in these contradictions, and we're gonna have to continue to tackle with them. But maybe just to finish this thought is I'm glad it's us doing it. Because many of these vulnerable residents were being sent into private rooming houses and these private buildings with these speculative landlords, and the same situations were happening, but there was no one trying to figure out a solution to these, resolution, looking for other resources. So, it's gonna be hard, but I think it's the work we're here to do. So what does relational transformation look like? Cooney talked about political subjectivity and changes. This paper is amazing for identifying these different kind of changes in subjectivity. Individual subjectivity, people shift from capitalist identities, consumers, property owners, and service recipients to seeing themselves as members of a collective focused on community well-being. Collective responsibility, where communities build shared understandings of injustice and power through organizing and learning, and then they act collectively. And I think we can actually identify these moments where it's working by identifying these moments of transformation where the subjectivities are changing, where we can see that something is changing and how people understand what is going on and what their place is in it and are acting on it. One way that we're doing this is through our community governance, where we make decisions together with each other, about each other, for each other. That's one process through our community governance process. Through community planning, like Cooney said, we're building that collective subjectivity, an analysis of the problems in our neighborhood and solutions that we think are necessary and acting on them. But some of the deepest moments of transformation are more subtle. And Cooney has referenced this story already, but I just have to get into it a bit deeper because it's just so critical. If we're not paying attention to these moments, we will miss them. Instead, we need to uplift them. Lefebvre described the process of residential alienation, how capitalist housing separates people from community and agency. De-alienation reconnects people with their lived environments. CLTs contribute to making this possible by transforming housing from a commodity into a collective space of belonging. But CLTs don't do this. The people who live there, the people who are involved do. The goal is not just to secure housing, it's to provide the context for people to restore dignity, agency, and connection. Cooney told this story a little bit, but I want to expand on it. When we bought this building, tenants told us that the prior landlord had not let them use the backyard. And it was so extreme that we heard a story about a tenant building a picnic table so two people could sit back there. And the landlord came out with a chainsaw and cut it in half and threw the picnic table out on the front yard. So, enforced the fact that this was not a space for tenants. And so the first thing we did when we took ownership is we built 4 garden beds. We invited tenants to come garden, and Sonam was there and helped. She brought her seedlings. and we planted some plants together. And in that process, an amazing woman named Renee, took leadership. And, she had actually she told us she'd never grown food before, like plants, but she really enjoyed the process. And then she became obsessed, and she's so skilled at it. And she's also skilled at building things. And she transformed the space, not just alone. She invites people to do it with her, but she kind of has this like natural sense of how to make things happen, and she does it. Cooney talked about how the Lantress owning the building and saying it's hers, it's theirs to live in, created the opportunity for her to do it, which is true. But also she took it, and we oh, that's cool, step back, let it happen. And it's been amazing. It creates a space for gathering. And the whole vibe in the building changed through this process. It's hard to describe, but when we go to the building, people aren't just mad. They aren't just frustrated. They also sometimes just want to hang out, and there's a sense of community. And this is where we do things like talk about the future of the building together in this space. And so these are kind of like moments of transformation. Renee invited us to a barbecue, and Fatine and I and Renee and Tendon and a bunch of us were sitting there and talking about life. Not just the toilet that's broken, and we were talking about the land trust, and we were talking about the future. And it was clear that the tenants were starting to realize that something was very different about the place they lived and the community they lived in. And we were collaborating on what might happen next. And there's these agents of change. Like Renee's been this agent of change in that she's made this space what it is. She's brought people around it. And we need to find a way to get out of the way of these agents of change and support them the best we can to make the places they live better. And there's formal ways to do this. Down in downtown Eastside, they're creating these tenant-led initiatives. So they're actually supporting people with compensation, training, et cetera, to lead initiatives in their homes. And this is my last little narrative. So I'm going to come back to Milky Way and also talk about things we've seen happen there. We have another agent of change in the room. Sonam over here. So the Milky Way was a private property, and Sonam and Tish and other community members have been gardening there with permission of the private owner for quite a while. And then the property needed to be sold, and the land trust was asked to step in and bring it into community ownership so they could continue to grow food there. And we did it. There were existing leaders already on this land, doing work, taking care of it, stewarding it. And so we saw our role as supporting them, making sure that that could continue into the future. And then maybe other people could also do some of that stewardship on that land. And Sonam joined the board very early, and she became the longest lasting board member on our boards. She's the first person to have to leave the board because she completed 3 terms. She participated through, there was interpretation at all meetings, because while she's learning English, she's not as fluent, so fluent in English that she can participate in a board meeting about property in English. And she's been amazing. She's brought like the experience on the land into the decisions about housing and other activities we do. Attendant and Sonam collaborated on the Parkdale Tower rental study. So she also went and spoke to other residents in her building about their experiences in the rental housing. So, you know, and our new projects she's also informing. So Sonam's subjectivity has definitely changed. But I learned something amazing from her this year, and this is where we end. She's been hosting events at the Milky Way Garden, just like self-organized events for a few years. And like, we get invited every year, but didn't make sense till this year. The events are for Dalai Lama's birthday. And she brings people together, she makes food. She invites local spiritual leaders and community members and gardeners and the land trust. She's like, come out and celebrate Dalai Lama's birthday with us on this land. And she shares stories about her spirituality and the relationship between that spirituality and her history and the land. And she relates it back to her people and the story, the complex, long history, lineage, spirituality, and story. And it happens on the land, and other people talk about their relationship to the land and their histories too. And it's beautiful, and it's what we're supposed to be creating opportunities for. And there's this amazing term that I read about recently called emergence geographies. Practices bring people together, creating what Laura Haro calls emergence geographies, the spatial expressions of community knowledge, self-determination, and collective power. This can sometimes happen through culture, ritual, art, celebration, and being in shared space. These are places where community takes form, not through ownership, but through relation. At the Land Trust, we see these moments of cultural connection, like Sonam's annual celebration of the Dalai Lama, that weave intergenerational spiritual and emotional meaning in place into this place. These events are not only peripheral, they are transformative. They build trust, belonging, and care, and they help us imagine a future that's connected to the present and connected to our pasts. We need to, Laura Haro also, kind of in relation to the idea of emergent geographies, states that we must recognize communities' ability to assert self-determination and to conceive of, act upon, an appropriate space necessary to realize community aspirations. In a sense, our work becomes a form of collective self-determination, asserting the right to define what a full life means. She writes, we practice collective power when we shift the notion that what a full life is away from capital and commodities to something that is filled with relationality, positive energy, safe spaces, and geographies of emergence. And I think that what's happening in the Milky Way and in the Land Trust generally is creating these many geographies of emergence. Some of them are physical, some of them are conceptual. And I think we're winning. We're small but growing. The struggle is going to continue to expand social power. This work happens inside and out, but we're not alone. Our futures are held together. Thanks so much for your patience.